Hello again. This is the first of three videos I'm going to make about characters in Do the Right Thing, all to get you ready for writing the essay that you'll write during final exams week. As the Moodle page explains, um, when you open the essay to begin, it will give you one of three randomly selected topics having to do with one of these three characters that we're about to talk about. This video here is about Sal. The next one will be about Bugging Out, and the third one will be about Mookie. You'll be assigned one of those, and the topic will come to you in the form of a question, or maybe a series of a couple of questions. And as usual, the plan is that if you answer the question in the right way, it could be a thesis for your paper, right? So we're going to talk about Sal a bit, and I want to begin by talking about language and labels. When I'm teaching this in the classroom, I'll often begin by asking how many racists we have in the classroom, and ask people to raise their hand if they're a racist, and no one ever does, because of course we don't have any racists in our class. Well, it opens a discussion for why it is that obviously we have racists in America, but very few people will admit to being racists. And why is that? Well, one reason is that it's there's a stigma to it, right? It's a negative thing. People don't like to be seen as a racist. It's an embarrassment. It's socially disapproved of. But there's another reason that's maybe even more widespread, and that's that people aren't really aware of their own racism. And that's something that I know sometimes students resist, the idea that that someone else might see something in you that you don't see in yourself, but it's true, as you'll discover, I think. So, talking about the words here, first of all, we could talk about racist. When we talk about someone being a racist, it's an identity. Racist is a noun, and it refers to the person. And if you say someone is a racist, then at least for that moment while you're talking about the person that way, that becomes that person's identity. And it seems like a pretty total thing. It sort of defines who they are. And so, typically, I don't think people want to be identified as racist. There might be some people who, among the right people, might actually, proudly claim to be racist. I don't know. Most people want strongly to deny that. And, we many of us have met the uncle from Kansas who will say, well, I'm not racist, but, and then goes on to say something that seems clearly racist. And, seeing a person doing that and not understanding what they're doing should make all of us pause and think maybe we're doing things we don't understand. And maybe there are things about ourselves that we don't understand. So there's being a racist, and then there's racism, which is not an identity. Racism, it's another noun, but racism it's an ideology. It's a way of thinking. Racism, I would guess I would say, is any kind of distortion in your thinking about, or distortion in your thinking that's based on race. It actually comes in a few familiar flavors. One is, when we make generalizations about people, or stereotypes as we call them, a person who holds beliefs that other people come in these stereotyped forms. There's the idea of racial superiority and inferiority. In other words, that's different from stereotypes are you know what that is? It's a kind of identity that you believe that people of a certain race or gender or something um, are or often are kind of a predictable type. Whereas racial superiority, you're actually applying kind of a value judgment to different races. This race is better than that race, and so on. Then there's also race hatred, and I guess that's close to number two, which is about superiority and inferiority. Race hatred, if there's a person whose hatred of another person is based on race, we would call that racism. So racism is distortion in your thinking, and I think, as I said, few people would admit to being racist or recognize that they're racist, but it's easier for people to recognize maybe there's some racism in their thinking. They wouldn't like to hear that or acknowledge that, but it seems less total than saying that someone is a racist. The third term I have there is race consciousness. And what that means, I guess, is just being aware of that race exists and noticing that different people are of different races. So if I ask who is race conscious in the class, probably most of us, all of us, would have to say, yes, we're aware of race. But then, does our race consciousness bring with it some sense of evaluation of one race over another, or are there certain beliefs about how people of a certain race behave? And if so, if there's some racism in us, at what point could we be defined as a racist? So, all right. A fourth term we might consider is racial pride. And, in America, we're often told that we should be proud of our race and our ethnicity, and for good reason. There's people have been disrespected because of their race and ethnicity, and it's important to resist that and to not feel ashamed about who you are. But race pride, if someone like Sal says, I like Italians the best, Italians are the best. Well, if Italians are the best, that means that other people are not as good, which means there's a belief in racial superiority, which is a problem. So, um, you know, it's important to feel racial pride, but at the same time, it's dangerous to feel it. So, to turn to this story in particular, the question is whether Sal is a racist. Is he a racist? And does he harbor some racism? Is maybe a gentler, less extreme question to ask about him. Does he harbor some racism? In other words, does he have in him some racist thinking? And as we'll see, there are plenty of ambiguities. There's a lot of evidence about whether Sal is a racist or not, or whether he has some racism in his thinking. But ultimately, we can't say yes or no because the evidence, like a lot of real life evidence, is complex and can be read in more than one way. Um, if we were putting Sal on trial, and we wanted to demonstrate whether he was racist or not, probably the first evidence we'd have to bring in would be his the racial slurs that he uses when Radio Raheem and Bugging Out and Smiley come into the restaurant, and Sal, I'm not going to write it down. I'm not going to write it down. He says, oops, got the wrong word there. Now, there's not much I was able to actually write out there because other than the words you and black, they're all obscenities and slurs. But this is what Sal says to Radio Raheem and Bugging Out. That's pretty bad, right? And in both cases, he's not just insulting them, but he's tying it to their racial identity. And, I ask you, I'll put a bet on it. I don't think you can come up with stronger language in English to put somebody down than the words we have here. These are very extreme, right? So how is it that Sal, who uses language like that, is not a racist, right? That seems like he is a racist. Well, I think there are two ways that it could be explained. One is Sal is a racist and maybe secretly knows it, or maybe is unaware of it. And through most of the day, he can kind of kid himself and everybody else. But under the pressure of that situation, when the three guys come in and they want to boycott his restaurant, and he's furious about it, then you could say, he opens up and we see what's truly inside of him. He could no longer hide his racism that's it's present in him. It's who he really is, and he lost control and revealed who he really is. Maybe so. Another way to look at it is that he was really angry, and Bugging Out came at him talking about race, and saying we want brothers on the wall of fame, and calling him a guinea bastard and things like that, slur against Italians. So the issue was about race, and Sal, being the angry hothead that he is, you could say, reached for what he knew would be the most hurtful language he could find. He's somebody who will take a baseball bat and threaten customers with a baseball bat when he feels like he's being disrespected. So we know that he's somebody who reaches for lethal weapons, and you could say that the language he uses in that scene is just the words that he knows, the phrasing that he knows will hurt the most, given who Bugging Out and especially Bugging Out and Radio Raheem are, because they have this racial pride that they are presenting to the world. So Sal cuts them down by using language that he knows will be the most offensive possible to him. So, which is it? Well, the movie doesn't say, and Sal himself probably couldn't say. There was a comedian named, I forget his name. He is the guy who played Kramer on Seinfeld. He was maybe 10 years ago. He was in a comedy nightclub, and the audience didn't think he was very funny. He wasn't doing very well, and he started to get frustrated. And it was predominantly an African American crowd, and he began to let fly with some racial slurs. And since this was, the modern world, somebody was videotaping it with their phone, and the next day it was on the internet, and his career was ruined. You don't see him anymore. And the very next day after that, he was on, I think, the David Letterman show or some TV show, and he was trying to explain, it's just what happened is just crazy, because the thing is, I'm not a racist. I don't know where that came from. I'm not racist. And, he was seemingly authentic in denying his racism, and yet he said just some horrible things. And, they were not just mean things to say, but they were about race. And when I saw that, I thought, well, that's just like Sal. That's somebody who either doesn't know that he harbors that racism in him, or somebody who has kind of, reached for the strongest weapon possible, the strongest verbal weapon possible when they got really angry. All right. Another thing to consider, Sal has two sons. One is Pino. He is very clearly a racist, and the other, Vito, is not. The two sons seem to represent love and hate. It's another aspect of the love and hate theme in this movie. And, people's children we often think of as an expression of them or a reflection of them. What does that tell us about Sal? Well, it seems to tell us that he's got maybe two sides, or that his identity is, again, ambiguous and puzzling and unknown. Maybe he's a racist, and maybe he's not, or maybe he's sort of both at the same time somehow. He hires Mookie, right? So that's another thing. You could say, well, he hires Mookie, and so, no racist would do that. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. He really likes Mookie, and he says Mookie's like a son to him. That's good. That's sort of in his favor. To say that somebody is like a part of your family. He said the restaurant one day will be named Sal and Sons, and it'll always include Mookie because he's been like a son to me. That's, somebody who says that is not seeing racial barriers. He's claiming Mookie as, part of his family. On the other hand, Mookie is the guy who delivers the pizza. He's not really part of the business, part owner of the business. He's the delivery person. And you could say, well, that was just strictly a business deal for Sam. He chose somebody who's from the neighborhood, who would know the addresses and know the people. And Mookie's pretty well liked, and so he would be a good face for the organization delivering the pizzas. So it could just be a neutral kind of business move, or you could say Sal keeps his sons in the restaurant and hires somebody else to do the delivery because he's fearful of sending his sons out into a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood. Again, the movie doesn't say. We just see the facts, and we don't know what Sal's motives are, and maybe they're one, maybe they're the other, maybe they're a little bit of both, and he hasn't really thought it through himself. Um, he also likes Mookie's sister Jade, and sometimes I've had students say, "Well, that demonstrates that he's not racist because he really likes Jade." But you can like somebody of a race that you disrespect, right? If we make a comparison to gender, there are lots of times when men or women um, are attracted to somebody or like somebody of the other gender, um, but in general, they have a strong distaste for, to give you the typical example, I think there are men who really who are interested in dating women and get married and so forth, but they really don't like women, right? That happens, but you can be attracted to somebody and not respect them. In fact, to put it back in the context of race, in American history, there were plenty of slave masters who had children with their slave women, and so those were white men who were interested in and attracted to black women. Did I say white women, white men? White men, black women, um, and for sure those were um, people with racist beliefs. They were slave owners, and yet they established relationships um, with African American women, sometimes through rape, sometimes through other kinds of arrangements. Our own um, founding father, Thomas Jefferson, had multiple children with one of his slaves. Um, and he was somebody who was in some ways against slavery, and yet he had slaves his whole life. Um, Very complicated. Um, you could also argue that Sal is not racist because look, he has this restaurant in an African American and Hispanic neighborhood. Um, but the movie shows that he's been there a long time, that the neighborhood has changed over the years from more of a mixed neighborhood to more of a predominantly black neighborhood. And his son Pino wants to move the restaurant to their own neighborhood, which is predominantly Italian. Um, Sal says he's been there for 25 years and he's not moving because, as he says in the screenplay, in my printed version of the screenplay, it's page 196. He says, page 197, he says, there's too many pizzerias there already. And Pino says, my friends laugh at me all the time, laugh right in my face, for working in that neighborhood. And Sal says, do your friends put money in your pocket, pay your rent, put food on your plate? Yeah, I didn't think so. Right? So there, Sal's argument is not, hey, I don't want to move. I like the people here. He's making an economic argument saying, um, this is where our money comes from. We can't move. There's too many pizzerias in our neighborhood, he says. Um, um, he also says, this, on page 198, so what if this is a black neighborhood? So what if we're a minority? I've never had no trouble with these people and don't want none neither. So don't start none. This is America. Sal's famous pizzeria is here to stay. So this is America. It means, this is a place where there's people of all different races. We have diversity here. That's just the way it is. Which sounds like he's accepting of diversity. But at the same time, he talks about these people, which is, in American um, in American culture, that is a borderline slur in itself. These people talking about it sounds like a generalization, right? And some people would take exception to that. On the other hand, it was Mookie who brought up the idea of the neighborhood as being, you know, drawing attention to the race of people in the neighborhood and lumping them together. Um, in the film, you'll notice that sometimes there are differences between the screenplay and the film, and that's because, when the screenplay is written, um, it's considered to be a final draft. But then when the movie is made, there are changes that are introduced when the actor or the director or somebody improvises or revises the dialogue. So when you're writing your paper, if you see something from either the film or the screenplay that you want to use, feel free, even if there's a difference between the two. So anyway, he says in the film, but not in the screenplay, um, you know, the people in this neighborhood, I watched the little kids grow up, and I watched the adults get older, and people here grew up on my pizza, and I'm proud of that. That's that is a sign that Sam is really, you know, he feels connected to them in almost like a family way, like he's the parent feeding the neighborhood, and sharing a meal with people is a way of it's an important way of connecting in any culture, right? You sit down and have a meal with somebody, um, you're saying that you're part of their tribe and they're part of your tribe, and he says he's proud of that. So if Sal were consciously racist, um, and in the middle of the day with nobody else in the restaurant, his obviously racist son wanted to talk about the neighborhood in a derogatory way, um, seems likely that if Sal really were a racist, it'd be easiest for him to go along with Pino and agree, but he doesn't. He argues against um, he argues against Pino's racism. So um, again, it's complicated. Almost any evidence you can find in the movie that demonstrates that he's a racist could be explained through some other means. That doesn't mean he's not a racist. It means that people's motives and the reasons they do things are often complicated. um, the last thing I want to talk about with Sal is the Wall of Fame, because that becomes, a point of struggle between him and Bugging Out. Um, Sal in his restaurant has a wall of fame, and it's all Italians, Italian Americans. Um, and the question is that a sign of racism? I think Bugging Out sees it as a sign of racism. The wall of fame, and they're all white people. Um, the obvious defense for Sal is that this is an Italian restaurant, and so this is part of the theme of the restaurant. This is the Italian culture that is represented by the food. Um, yeah, that's legitimate. But on the other hand, he's putting up photos of Italian American celebrities and calling it a wall of fame. So there is an intention that these are people who are heroic somehow and ought to be admired. And um, so, you know, again, I mentioned if someone feels racial pride, um, how far away is that from feeling racial superiority? And Bugging Out comes into the restaurant and sees this on the wall, and because he's sensitized to race issues, he recognizes that if Sal is saying Italians are the best, then that means, in a unstated way, it's kind of a put down of others. So it becomes a point of conflict between them. When Bugging Out says, "How come there's no brothers on the wall?" Sal says, "You want brothers on the wall? You get your own restaurant, and you can have your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles." He says, "Your mothers, your stepfathers, stepmothers." Um, so, when Bugging Out says brothers on the wall, what he means, of course, is African American men. When Sal says you can have your brothers or sisters or mothers or stepfathers, aunts, uncles, he's making fun of that concept a little bit by naming a bunch of other family relations, and by not just saying mothers and fathers, but stepmothers and stepfathers. He's bringing in a stereotype into the conversation, and it's a way of putting down Bugging Out's race, talking about the African American family as being um, made up of broken marriages and step parents and stepchildren and so forth. So I don't think that's accidental on Sal's part. There are other points in the movie where, when he's angry, he can bring in racialized language. When Mookie is late getting back from delivering a pizza, Sal tells him, "You're pushing it, Mookie. One more time, you're late one more time, and you're going to be on the street with your homeboys." Well, that's obviously intended to be an attack on Mookie for his race, right? To say that you're going to be on the street with your homeboys. He's using black slang, but also talking about being on the street. There's the stereotype of African American street life and homelessness and gang banging and all that. So Sal can say some jerky, racially tinged things when he's angry, and it all comes back to whether he's doing that because he knows that's a weapon that will hurt, or because in a moment of weakness he revealed who he really is. And in the real world, probably a little bit of both, because the world's complicated. All right. So we finished up talking about the Wall of Fame. The next video, I'll talk about Bugging Out, because he's the one who's on the other side of that argument about the Wall of Fame. And I'll post that video tomorrow, being Friday, May 8th. All right. See you then.